User familiarity is probably one of the biggest reasons why you would want to choose a system font. I'm talking about San Francisco Pro for iOS or Apple related products, or something like Roboto for Android, or also like any number of open source fonts that are easily available and usable. Because if you think about the way that you use your phone, you're going to be using it as a utility first kind of tool. You're going to be checking the time, the weather, setting alarms, and scrolling through various social media posts. And the system font serves as a passageway to get you to the content that you're actually trying to see or hear or watch, or, as much as I hate to say the word, consume. It's not that common, specifically with app-based interface design, when there's a big opportunity to go super custom with big super custom fonts. Interface design for the web is a slightly different story. And it's not to say that you can't have super custom fonts on an app. It's just maybe a little bit trickier. But we'll dig into some of those nuances in just a minute. Learning to design with the system font stack is a great way to tiptoe into the world of typography. As you get more confident and you want to venture out, then you can start experimenting. And in fact, I encourage you to do that. Using new and unique fonts are amazing ways to stand out from other websites and pieces of software. You just have to make sure that you don't overdo it. And you kind of want to learn the principles of solid fundamental type design before you start relying on elegant fonts to kind of serve as a crutch when you're missing some of the fundamentals. So using restraint in design is often a foreign concept for new designers. So you don't be afraid to consciously not over-design something, especially when it comes to crazy typography. It's tempting to choose something big and crazy, but if you really need to make sure that you have the context for what you're designing for nailed down before you start making those decisions. And one less decision to make when you're designing a new project by using a system font is a great thing to do sometimes, because there's so many other decisions to make. Sometimes you're designing for a brand that already has a specific font that is custom for them and it's their brand font, and you just use that and you have to make it work. Other times you're designing specifically for iOS and Android, so it just makes sense to start with the system font. So using constraints, even if they are self-enforced constraints, is a great way to make great designs. And having an endless possibility of fonts and colors and pictures and graphics, it's an easy way to get really overwhelmed. So starting with system fonts can be a strategy to just make it a little bit easier on yourself. So if you want to make it easier on yourself when you're getting started, then just consider going with straight up, tried and true system fonts. It doesn't make you any less of a designer. So I want to encourage you to use San Francisco Pro if you are designing for Apple-based things, or even like a web-based application, because Apple's using it in all of their products and a lot of their products look really great. So there's not a problem with going with that. So you're completely okay to use system fonts as long as you're able to use them in a very nice way, setting line height, setting margins and alignment and spacing. All the proper fundamental techniques can be easily applied to any of the system fonts and make them look great. Performance is another really big factor when it comes to choosing a font, and especially going with a system font. Speed and performance is typically pretty key when you're making apps or websites. So baking a font set into a downloadable app isn't that big of a deal in terms of overall app size and performance, but when you're using custom fonts on the web, oftentimes there's JavaScript that must be called, and there's a third-party server, and load times can be a little bit slower. It can easily get bloated and can slow down the speed time of some initial loads. And slower time means visitors bouncing. Visitors bouncing means fewer conversions, and at the end of the day, we're designing websites, mobile apps for people to use. So what's the point of designing something that's hard to use? And I'm not trying to slam custom fonts. I love custom fonts. You just have to be wise when you use them. But there's so many considerations to sift through. So again, don't feel bad to start with system fonts. It's totally fine. Cost can be another huge factor. Are you or your client willing to purchase a custom font or pay for it annually if there's some kind of views per month, views per year associated with it? I did one time even convince a client to spend over $1,000 on the complete FF Mark font family, and I really did believe that that was going to be an awesome font for their project, and I thought it turned out great. It was the Skyscanner project I've shown you in some of the other examples. And there's been plenty of other occasions where I suggested specialized fonts for web design projects and mobile app projects. It's just a matter of, does it make sense for that brand? does it make sense for that project? And are the other factors kind of covered when you're considering those custom fonts? But I will say all of those would have been fine to use system fonts. I've designed so many projects with San Francisco or Roboto or a version of a font that's already pre-baked into iOS like Avenir or any of the other pre-baked in Apple fonts. So remember, system fonts and their various weights can take you very far. You know, look at San Francisco. It's got black, bold, semi-bold, heavy, there's italics, there's a number of different ways that you can use it. And at the end of the day, I want to drill into you that system fonts are a good thing. And you really only need to venture outside the box when you reach a point where it just feels like you need something different. And that might be on your very first project, but I want to recommend just starting with system fonts, and that's okay. But if you want to put it aside, that's okay too. You are the designer, so unless there are specific font requirements for your project, whether it's from the client or whoever, you should decide to use a system font. And when you feel like going custom, talk to the developers, talk to the client, talk to whoever's involved, and have those discussions up front. So for homework, I've been assigning most of the homework with the Enter font because it's kind of open source. It's works well on both Mac and PC. And there's a lot of projects that have also had San Francisco Pro that you've used possibly. So for this assignment, let's do something a little bit different, slightly different. I want you to, if you've used San Francisco Pro or Enter for a lot of your projects, I want you to just switch it up and try Roboto. Or if you've been using Roboto, try San Francisco. But I would assume you've probably been using Enter or San Francisco. So if that's you, go with Roboto. And you may want to make a slight change to the sizes or the way that this font's being used. But I want you to redesign the stripe checkout and have this be an extension of some of the homework from the previous lessons where we had the e-commerce grid, the product detail. So now we're gonna kind of redesign the stripe checkout, and it doesn't have to be a complete rethinking of the entire thing. You can copy it basically as is, make some slight tweaks, put your product in there, and use the Roboto font and just kind of see how it feels. And you can do the web version or the mobile version like we did in some of the other ones. But I just want the big takeaway for this lesson to be system fonts are totally fine, and you can learn a lot of the principles without having to make decisions on custom fonts, and only venture out when you feel necessary. And you know, you're not any less of a designer because you're using San Francisco or you didn't come up with some awesome fancy font. So let that message empower you, and let's get designing this homework with some good old system fonts.